The CBSA office in charge of my deportation is located at 1010 Saint Antoine Street West, 2nd floor, Montreal, QC, H3C1B2. In this case, there are only two solutions: either go to the embassy to receive an emergency travel document to return to your country of origin, or to be imprisoned for 3 months in Canada and then deported with handcuffs. What would you do in this situation? Guess who is the person who was selected by the CBSA to handle my deportation? The same person who put me in jail for 10 days, Eric Cournoyer. I want to remind you that in December 2017 that person worked at Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport and now works at 1010 Saint Antoine Street West, 2nd floor, Montreal. The distance between the airport and the CBSA office on Saint Antoine Street is 17 kilometers. Do you think it's a coincidence? No, he was selected to F*CK me, legally with documents. I will never forget those 10 days I was imprisoned. I also understood that Moldova will never be a member of NATO or a member of the European Union. Why? Because of the corruption and incompetence of those in the West. If they don't believe in their own values, why should I fight for those values? If you believe that there is no corruption in the Canadian government, all you have to do is Google search corruption in the Canadian government and there will be a lot of corruption scandals. The current government of Canada, Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Marihuana, is known as the most corrupt government in the history of Canada. Today is my last day in Canada. I do not return voluntarily but because my appeal was dismissed and I have no choice but to leave Canada. Do Canadians know what will happen to me when I return to Moldova? Of course they know. Because in December 2017 I was arrested at Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport for 10 days because of the criminal case that the Communists opened against me in 2009. From January 2018 until now I am under judicial control in Canada because of the criminal case that was opened to me by the Communists. I haven't been to Moldova for 11 years. I resisted as long as I could. But because of the corruption and incompetence of Canadians, I have to return to Moldova. The criminal complaint I filed to the prosecution Canada after a year of silence from Canadian institutions was sent to about 60 embassies accredited in Canada and also to embassies accredited in Moldova. The only hope for me is for the ambassadors to intervene. Now I am in Moldova. I left Moldova in 2010 and for 11 years I was not in the Republic of Moldova. If in 2010 I was to stay in Moldova, I would either be imprisoned or I would work for the Russians now. The Russians have made an enormous effort to bring me to Moldova and now they will do everything possible for me to stay in Moldova. During all this time I left Moldova, the Russians recruited friends, colleagues from the university, including very close relatives. Now I am in Moldova and most likely they will try to lock me up in prison, in psychiatry, or accidental death in order not to allow me to leave Moldova again. I have never worked for any institution in Moldova or Romania, and I repeat for Polish and Canadian idiots. I have not worked for any institution in Moldova or Romania and I have never worked for any security institution. I have not been to the Republic of Moldova for 11 years and the only thing that could arrest me in Moldova is the file that was opened to me by the Communists for the events of April 7, 2009. If they open a criminal case for April 7, 2009, and I am imprisoned, that means I will become a political prisoner. And I have been to several countries, and my situation is known to the whole of Europe. Which the Russians will avoid doing, but will try to open an economic criminal case. As I have not been in Moldova for 11 years and now I avoid working for any institution in Moldova, they will try to ask for help from their agency in countries where I have been. For example, the Russians turned to the Georgian oligarch, who had shares in Gazprom, to open a criminal case against me, and for that there must be an agreement between Moldova and Georgia. If after 20 years of American military presence in Afghanistan they have demonstrated zero analytical ability, Why do you think they are more professional in Eastern Europe? If you want to understand the incompetence of the intelligence services, you must read the book Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA, Wiener, Tim. How stupid they were and were fooled. Even if they have high-performance technology, they are always stupid in analysis. In Moldova, the Russians have become more sophisticated and many Russian projects are funded by the Americans. Just as in Afghanistan, the Americans collaborated and invested in pragmatic people, and at the first opportunity these individuals left the country. The same situation in Moldova, the Americans have collaborated with pedophiles, pimps, rapists. A Ukrainian judge seeking political asylum in Moldova has been abducted by 3 individuals. SOS's lawyer confirmed that his client had been abducted. Today, April 3, 2021, my client, the Ukrainian judge, SOS Nikolai, was kidnapped from the center of Chisinau, whose application for political asylum is being examined by the courts of the Republic of Moldova. He was abducted by an armed group of people and taken in an unknown direction. The intelligence services of Moldova and Ukraine were involved in this abduction with the consent of the President of the Republic of Moldova and the President of Ukraine, Maya Sandu and Volodymyr Zelensky. And cars with diplomatic numbers of the Ukrainian embassy in Chisinau were used to cross the border without control. Initially, the judge said that he was abducted and there is a video of him being abducted from Chisinau, but then he changed his statements. There are many ways to persuade a person to change their statements. No one from Moldova has been arrested, will probably be investigated after the current president/government loses power. I think that corruption is a common thing for Moldova and Ukraine. There are very few honest judges and prosecutors in Moldova, at least I have not heard of any honest and fair prosecutor in Moldova. Maybe they exist, but I have not heard that there are such people in Moldova. Every time the leadership changed in the Republic of Moldova, every time the new power tried to ride the General Prosecutor's office and the intelligence services, and the fight against corruption was nothing more than the imprisonment of adversaries/enemies. Prosecutors and judges are very rich because of the bribes they have received, and most of them are very easy to handle and make decisions that the power or the intelligence services want. Because most of them have a file involved in corruption cases, but they are not prosecuted, because the system needs them to make the decisions that the people in the system need. Most of them cannot justify their wealth, and some of them write their fortunes to their parents or relatives, and National Integrity Agency could arrest most Moldovan prosecutors, politicians, judges. Update/December 31, 2021. The fight for democracy. Free all political prisoners. After the arrest of Alexei Navalny, I created the site oppositionfree.com. After the arrest of Roman Protasevich, I created the site freeproda.com. I also bought 2 Telegram groups, with most of them being from the Russian Federation, and I also bought a group on a Russian social network with over 240,000 Russians, and I have 2 more groups on the same Russian social network, one of 24,000 Russians and the other only over 3,000 Russians. Mikhail Saakashvili was also arrested in 2021. 2021 was a miserable year for democracy. In the EU and the US, the national interest takes precedence over fundamental human rights, because if EU and US officials wanted these democracy fighters, they would be free. With my limited resources, I did something, but what did the officials who have the power? If the Russian opposition had been supported by the West, could have been prevented a war in Ukraine today? Yes, it could. Because in February 2014 I made the analysis that the Russians will take Crimea. It could have been prevented that the Russians will attack Ukraine in a total war in 2022, and that thousands of Ukrainian murders and millions of Ukrainian refugees in Europe could have been avoided. Yes, the war could have been avoided if the necessary steps were taken, because I wrote in my master's thesis about the independence of the separatist republics in Ukraine and about a Russian war on a large scale in Ukraine. If the Russian opposition had been supported by the West, would there still be a war in Ukraine today? Yes, it would have been a war because the Americans collaborate with idiots from Moldova, pimps, pedophiles, waiters and all the messes from Moldova / with a communist KGBist past, and in Romania it's the same, only they are a little more sophisticated there. And how is the situation in Moldova? It's like that everywhere with whom the Americans collaborate in the former Soviet and Warsaw Pact countries. The Americans had no chance to overthrow Putin's regime because they are too corrupt and too stupid. Those who have read my master's thesis think they have realized my intention. I use Telegram, and as you know, Telegram is founded by a Durov brothers who created another social network Vkontakte, and it was taken over as well as other businesses like Yevgeny Alexandrovich Shishvarkin, born on the 10th of September 1974 in Leningrad, RSFSR, Soviet Union, is a Russian entrepreneur who founded the largest Russian mobile phone retailer, Euroset. This made him the richest man under the age of 35 in his country, with an approximate worth of $1.6 billion. Those who do not know the history of this character recommend reading or watching the documentary/interviews with him. The intelligence services will always use the opportunity to suspect especially those in the East on a person who uses a social network created by a Russian. If you bother them to do contraband, cigarettes, metals, alcohol, drugs, etc. Usually they are the ones who protect these businesses together with the police, and when they don't have evidence/compromise to arrest or blackmail you, it's enough to have a social network that belongs to a Russian like Telegram. It is created by a Russian and the problem for them is solved. They can also get permission from the judge to tab the person of interest. But what do we do with those who use Google or Gmail, one of the two founders of which is also Russian? It is known that the founders of Google are Larry Page and Sergey Brin is of Russian origin. What are we doing? Do we suspect all Americans of espionage? Sounds ridiculous, and I agree. There are many Russian programmers working for Microsoft. I am sure Facebook has Russian programmers too. But the Russians who use Facebook, according to the logic of some, FSB should arrest all Russians for being American spies. Also, before the start of the war, there were many Russians who received money from Google AdSense and from the YouTube platform. All Russians have smartphones on Android or iPhone, which also have operating systems that are totally under the control of the Americans, and according to the logic of the Russians from the FSB, they had to arrest all the Russians who received money from the Americans or use American operating systems. I wrote about Telegram because I saw from several people on Facebook that it was a creature of the Russian services, and that's why I also gave examples with other online platforms. Unlike some, I don't consider all Russians to be FKG. If all Russians are FKG, then who is Alexei Navalny? Garry Kasparov? Khodorkovsky? What about Sergey Brin? By the way, Garry Kasparov was opposed to the idea of Russia returning to the Council of Europe after it was withdrawn with the Russian takeover of Crimea in 2014, but several European states voted for the Russians to return, and the Russians again attacked the Ukrainians in 2022 and again took over territories from the Ukrainians. Why did they vote for the Russians to return to the Council of Europe? German corruption, for example. When Navalny was poisoned, was there any reaction against the Putin regime? Any penalty or anything? Nothing. But when Navalny was arrested, was there any reaction? Any sanctions against the Putin regime? Nothing. What do we do with the Russians who are against the Putin regime and with those from the West who do/used to do business with the Putin regime? If those in the West had sanctioned every time people like Navalny are persecuted, we would have another democratic leadership in Russia today, but the corruption of the Germans is the basis of the Putin regime. So that we don't forget. Putin speaks German and also worked the German Democratic Republic as a KGBist.